bitter experience of Dunkirk taught Britain what China must have been feeling for the last 6 years, and how Australia, India, New Zealand and America felt after the Japanese attack in 1941. Just as Dunkirk was wide open to attack, so did the disaster of Pearl Harbor blow a hole in the Allied defensive line in the Pacific. Half the American fleet was put out of action. And before long, the Japanese were sweeping across Southeast Asia like a swarm of locusts. In less than 6 months, they'd advanced 3,000 miles. They'd cut the Burma Road. They'd reached India and were raiding in the Indian Ocean. And they were bombing Australia and her vital supply routes. Half the Pacific had become a Japanese lake, but gallant delaying actions by Australian, Indian, Chinese and Dutch troops forced the Japs to dig in and form a giant defensive ring. During the pause, reinforcements diverted from the west had time to reach the Pacific. Australian troops returned from the Middle East, and supplies, though only in small quantities, began to reach the battle area. But the Japanese defensive ring was not complete. There was a dent in it. Australian troops had managed to hold on to southwest New Guinea with its vital base at Port Moresby. This was our last foothold in the Pacific. The Japanese prepared an invasion fleet to take Moresby and flatten out the dent. But American naval forces were ready for them, and in the 4 days sea and air battle of the Coral Sea, this invasion fleet was scattered. The Japanese then tried to advance their ring at another point, Midway Island, 2,000 miles away across the Pacific. But they never reached it. American planes from land and from aircraft carriers struck home and inflicted heavy losses. These losses did much to reduce the Japanese Navy to the level of Allied sea power in the Pacific and gave the Allies a chance to plan offensive moves. Near to New Guinea is Guadalcanal in the Solomons, from which the Japanese threatened Port Moresby and Australia. They had built an airfield there, which enabled them to bomb our supply routes in all that area. The first Allied offensive move was to reduce this threat by taking Guadalcanal. The Americans captured the island and the newly built airfield. Despite heavy Japanese bombing and counterattacks, the Americans never lost their grip, though casualties were high and damage to newly landed material was heavy. With Guadalcanal in Allied hands, the dent in the Japanese ring was larger, and it gave us a means of taking the battle back into enemy territory. But the Japanese were not slow to act again. They were determined to establish their defensive ring before the full weight of supplies from the west could come in. They attacked again, this time by land in New Guinea, in another attempt to take Port Moresby. This meant crossing the Owen Stanley range of mountains, which run like a spine down New Guinea, separating Buna from Port Moresby. No one believed it possible for a modern army to carry its equipment across this barrier, but the Japanese did it, and with their greater experience of jungle fighting, they drove the Australians back almost to the outskirts of Port Moresby. As the Australians retreated, they gave ground in exchange for experience. Then, on the fringe of the jungle, with only a few miles to go, they made a stand. Port Moresby was saved. Heavy equipment began to be flown over from the mainland. Even heavy guns were flown over. The more powerful artillery and the aggressive patrols of the Australians finally forced the Japanese back. And as the Australians advanced, they manhandled some of these 25-pounders up the Owen Stanley Range. The Japanese advance over the range had been a military feat, but this was a campaigning miracle. At last, reinforcements began to arrive in some strength. 2 divisions of Australians were diverted from the Middle East. Air transport and airfields were so developed that even complete American regiments came in by air. While driving over the Owen Stanley Range, the Japanese had also made an attempt to get at Port Moresby by the back door. They landed by night at Milne Bay, down at the tip of New Guinea, with the idea of pushing along the coast. Reinforcements had only reached the Australians a few days before. Stores were still lying about the beaches. But the Australians cut the Japanese to pieces, completely defeating them, even though they thought they'd won the day by landing 2 tanks. The Royal Australian Air Force had managed to scratch runways out of the jungle and so make use of fighter aircraft, which played a great part in the success. Thus, this Japanese attack failed. The Australians had clung on to the main gap in the Japanese defensive ring. They took advantage of their success, drove on over the Owen Stanley Range, and after 7 weeks of bitter fighting, they broke through and took Buna. This was a major victory which the Japanese were loath to concede. They contested the attack bitterly, and their losses were great, for they realized that this meant a serious break in the defensive circle that they'd been building. The war in the Pacific is a fight between man and man under terrible conditions. Think of the problem of supplying an army under conditions like these. There was a time in New Guinea when, because of the difficulties of supply, no more than 500 men could be kept in food and ammunition at the end of a trail. To get over this problem, they developed the dropping of supplies by air wherever possible. But the main bulk still had to be carried by Papuan porters along the jungle trails. Think of the wounded and what they had to go through to get back to the base hospitals, often a 7 days carry from the front line. Here again the fine Papuans came to our help. For this is a war not only against the Japanese, but against malaria, dysentery, and all kinds of tropical diseases. The importance of this fighting in the Far East was realized in the West, and supplies and troops were diverted to the Pacific area. Strong additional support came from the Australian munitions production, which was stepped up tremendously despite the smallness of her population. India, too, was throwing in the weight of her enormous resources. By increasing our attacks on the outposts of the Japanese defensive circle, we were establishing bases from which eventually we could strike at the heart of Japan. We have already proved the Jap to be no Superman, and the Allies will soon be swinging their full weight into the Pacific battle, bringing relief and eventual victory to those hard-pressed countries who have so far carried the full burden of the Japanese attack.